I say who do you think came up with the idea of evolution, you're automatically going to say Darwin. But Darwin was not the only person to contribute to this idea, and he definitely didn't come up with all the parts of it on his own. There was this whole series of scientists prior to Darwin that helped inform his understanding. Hutton's theory of gradualism, Malthus understanding that populations grow faster than resources, and so competition is necessary. Darwin wasn't even the first person to come up with an idea of evolution. Lamarck was before him, and there were others prior, but Lamarck we're going to talk about in just a moment. While on his journey, Darwin was using the information from these previous scientists, including Lyell's principle of geology, to come to an understanding of the world around him. And by tying all of this information together, he came up with this idea of evolution and natural selection. Darwin could not have done all of this on his own. It's like the Newton quote that I'm paraphrasing here, that he was able to see as far as he did because he was standing on the shoulders of giants. Science is cooperative and it builds upon prior knowledge, and Darwin was able to do that with his theory of natural selection. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was one of the earlier ideas of what evolution is, and he believed that organisms evolved through an acquiring of traits within their lifetime, so that the giraffe whose ancestors fed on taller leaves or higher leaves, their neck got longer over time. He had these ideas of use and disuse and perfection with use, but use and disuse is basically that organisms lose parts because they did not use them, like the missing eyes and digestive system of the tapeworm. And perfection with use and need is that the constant use of an organ leads to that organ to increase in size, like the muscles of a blacksmith or the large ears of a night-flying bat. So Jean-Baptiste, he had some good ideas, but we know now that some of his ideas were flawed. We're coming back around again into an energy understanding of how species evolve, and there might actually be some piece to this use and disuse, but the problem is the acquired traits. This is implying that species can evolve within a single lifetime, and we know this to be false. After graduating, Darwin was recommended to be the conversation companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy, preparing the survey ship Beagle for a voyage around the world. Fitzroy chose Darwin because of his education, his similar social class, and the similar age of the captain. Darwin noted that the plants and animals of South America were very distinct from those of Europe, and so he wasn't really hired to be the naturalist on the ship, but he kept collecting these species as he went. The origin of the fauna of the Galapagos, which was arguably the most important stop of his journey, caused Darwin to really sort of question. On further study, Darwin noted that while most of the animal species in the Galapagos lived nowhere else, they resembled species living in South America. It seemed that the islands had been colonized by plants and animals from the mainland that had then diversified on the different islands. So during this journey, Darwin was thinking about all these ideas and collected very clear evidence to support what he called his idea of natural selection. So we're going to look more in that as we go. The Galapagos was really one of his most important stops in the islands, and while he was there, he observed a lot of species, and he was very fascinated by the Galapagos tortoise and apparently tried to ride one. There was lots of different species of marine iguana. There's lots of species that are endemic to the Galapagos, but they resemble species living on the mainland, and Darwin began to notice that. But of particular importance, at least looking back, was his viewing of the birds. There are about 22 of the 29 species of birds that only live in the Galapagos, and one particular group was very, very diverse. And he was amazed to find out that these little small birds that he didn't pay much attention to were all finches. Some were woodpecker-like, some warbler-like, and some finch-like. But there were 14 species. How did that happen? If you go to South America, there was only one. So his idea was that, well, at some point, some of those birds from South America came to the Galapagos, and over time, diversified into what we see today. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one may come to the understanding, like Darwin did, that out of the original lack of species, these species modified over time to meet different goals, to fill different niches. And that makes sense when you keep in mind that Galapagos is a relatively recent volcanic island chain. So that one species of finch came here from South America and diversified. And this was Darwin's only true account of natural selection in his whole book on the origin of species by the means of natural selection, but it was a good one. Darwin came back to England in 1836, and he eventually drafted his theory of species formation in 1844. But he instructed his wife to publish the essay upon his death because he was very reluctant to publish but didn't want his ideas to die with him. And this probably would have been the way that it stayed if it wasn't for Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a young naturalist studying the East Indies, and he'd written a short paper on a new theory and asked Darwin to evaluate it. Darwin freaked out, eventually did publish his essay, and Wallace, just FYI, ended up supporting Darwin because he said that his ideas, not only did he come up with it first, but it had better data and more supporting information from his collections of his journey. Darwin defined evolution as a descent with modification. All organisms share a common ancestor, and over time, adaptations accumulate in the descendants that allow them to survive and reproduce. In his whole book, the word evolution is never used. On the very last page, the very last sentence, the word evolved is there. But Darwin was sort of afraid of this idea. He didn't want a lot of conflict, but he did still want to show his understanding. And he had 4 basic observations: that organisms vary, that organisms inherit traits from their ancestors, that species produce more offspring that can actually survive, and because of that limitation of offspring, there must be competition. So you can see some ideas here from prior scientists, especially Malthus with observation 3 and 4, but these observations formed the basis of Darwin's idea. From the basic information that Darwin had, Darwin was able to make a couple of inferences in his book. I do need to clarify one thing, though. His book on the origin of species by the means of natural selection, the first edition is the most correct. There were several editions during Darwin's life, if I remember correctly, 6 or 7. Various things changed over time. Each time he tried to address some of the counter-arguments, he tried to appease some of the religious arguments. So I will say again, his first edition was his most correct. In it, he made a couple of inferences, like I said. Individuals whose traits give them a better chance at surviving will have more offspring. We know that today as survival of the fittest, but Darwin didn't actually coin that term, and it wasn't until the 5th edition that that term became part of his book. Some species have an unequal ability to reproduce, and their genes and their traits will accumulate over time. And this, Darwin felt, was the source of evolution, or as he called it, descent with modification. Now, we know now that those traits aren't always physical traits. They could be physiological, or they could be biological, they could be behavioral. Reproductive success is all that matters from an evolutionary perspective, and we call that fitness. And if you take these inferences and you apply them over time, new variations will accumulate, and eventually new species will emerge. There are several limitations for natural selection, as you can see here, but what we see is that only traits that exist, that come from our ancestry, can be selected for. And just because we adapt does not always mean that the adaptations will be good in all situations and all environments. They're just a compromise for dealing with the current situation. Evolution is the intersecting point of natural selection and the environment and chance events and the pressures that those things have on species as a whole. There are a couple of common issues that I want to address. 1, individuals do not evolve. Okay, we are not going to be making Lamarckian statements. We are not looking at use and disuse within a generation causing change. A population is the smallest unit that can evolve by our current definition of evolution. Individuals mutate. Okay, second, natural selection, like we said a moment ago, can only act on heritable traits. That means that if you get a sunburn, you're not going to have a baby with sunburn. A blacksmith is not going to have children with larger muscles just because he has big muscles. Environmental factors vary. Traits that are good at one time, say the fur of a woolly mammoth, if you were to clone a woolly mammoth and put them out into the environment today, they would die of heat stroke. The environment does not stay constant. Number 4 is a big one here. Teleology. Evolution is not goal-oriented. Okay, an evolutionary trend does not mean that evolution is goal-oriented. It's all about want and need when people talk about, oh, well, they evolved so that they could do this. No, it's not like that. Okay, evolution is simply a result of differential reproductive success and evolutionary fitness. The tree did not evolve flowers so that it could be pollinated by the insect. Okay, that relationship came about over time. Now, the last one, evolution is not always better. Traits can be adaptive, they can be good, positive change over time, but they can also be maladaptive. The example on the right here is a Canadian elk, and there was a sexual pressure for the elk, with larger antlers, and eventually the species died because the males could not survive with these huge antlers. Surviving species do not represent the peak of perfection. There is a compromise and random chance involved, and we got to remember that that applies to humans as well.